The argument finally snapped into focus when people stopped debating tone and started asking what exactly had changed. Not whether the vice president should have chosen different words, but why those words suddenly felt unavoidable. For years, Washington had operated on the assumption that silence was strength and endurance was virtue. You absorbed the hits, redirected the conversation, and waited for the next news cycle to bury it. That system worked as long as attacks stayed abstract and impersonal. What rattled the Capitol this time was the sense that something intimate had been dragged into the public square. Once families became rhetorical weapons, the old playbook stopped offering clear guidance. You could either respond and risk being accused of instability, or stay quiet and risk normalizing the behavior. Neither option looked particularly noble anymore. That's the corner American politics has painted itself into. At that point, the confrontation between J.D. Vance and Adam Schiff stopped being about them personally and started being about expectations. Schiff's position rested on the belief that institutions only survive if leaders refuse to personalize conflict. Vance's position rested on the belief that institutions lose credibility when they ignore obvious human boundaries. Those ideas aren't mutually exclusive in theory, but they clash hard in practice. And when they clash, someone always ends up looking unreasonable. Schiff kept returning to precedent, to the idea that restraint is what separates democracy from spectacle. He spoke as though decorum itself were a load-bearing wall, and one crack could bring the whole structure down. There's logic there, and history backs some of it up. But precedent assumes a shared respect for limits that many voters no longer recognize. When one side believes the limits have already been erased, appeals to preserve them ring hollow. Vance's defenders argued that restraint has become asymmetrical. They pointed out that certain lines get crossed repeatedly with little consequence. When nothing happens, silence starts to feel less like dignity and more like permission. From that perspective, responding sharply isn't a breakdown, it's a correction. The risk, of course, is that corrections can overshoot their target. The debate quickly moved from what was said to what should be tolerated. Is it reasonable to expect public officials to absorb attacks on their families indefinitely? Is there a point where restraint stops protecting norms and starts protecting abuse? Who gets to decide where that line is and on whose behalf? Those questions lingered because no one offered an answer that satisfied everyone. What made the clash so resonant was how ordinary it felt beneath the drama. Most people watching weren't thinking about Senate rules or vice presidential precedent. They were thinking about their own breaking points. They recognized the moment when patience runs out and composure gives way to reaction. That recognition blurred the line between political analysis and personal empathy. Critics of Vance insisted that public office requires a higher threshold for provocation. They argued that leaders don't have the luxury of reacting like private citizens. The job, they said, is precisely to rise above that impulse. But that argument quietly assumes that leaders can wall off their private lives at will. In a hyper-connected age, that assumption feels increasingly detached from reality. Supporters countered that expecting superhuman detachment isn't realistic or fair. They noted that families of politicians didn't sign up to be rhetorical punching bags. If the cost of leadership is permanent vulnerability for loved ones, the price may be too high. That concern isn't ideological, it's human. And human concerns have a way of breaking through even the thickest institutional armor. The humor that bubbled up around the debate revealed how strained the situation had become. Commentators joked that Washington prefers its emotions pre-approved by legal counsel. Others quipped that authenticity is praised until it becomes inconvenient. These jokes landed because they exposed a contradiction everyone senses. Politics demands humanity while punishing its visible expression. As the days passed, the conversation hardened into camps. One camp treated Schiff's warnings as essential guardrails. The other treated Vance's response as an overdue boundary. Very few people occupied the middle for long, because the middle offers no emotional payoff. Outrage and condemnation are easier to package than ambivalence. What almost no one disputed was that the incident reflected a broader erosion of trust. Trust that criticism will stay focused on ideas. Trust that families won't become collateral damage. Trust that silence will be interpreted as dignity rather than weakness. When that trust evaporates, behavior changes. The institutionalist view assumes that systems can absorb stress without changing character. The populist view assumes that systems only adapt when pressure is applied. Schiff spoke from the first assumption, Vance acted from the second. Both assumptions have merit, and both have blind spots. That's why the confrontation felt unresolved rather than decisive. Observers also noted how selective outrage shaped the reaction. Some voices who usually celebrate blunt speech suddenly demanded decorum. Others who usually decry harsh rhetoric suddenly applauded it. The reversal was almost comical, if it weren't so revealing. Principles, it seemed, were flexible, depending on who was speaking. The role of media amplified those inconsistencies. Panels framed the story through familiar partisan lenses. Sound bites replaced context, and context replaced curiosity. Few outlets lingered on the uncomfortable gray areas. Gray areas don't fit neatly into segments. What lingered instead was the sense that something had shifted. Not a revolution, not a collapse, but a recalibration. Leaders were being forced to confront the limits of old strategies. Ignore it, and you look detached. Engage it, and you look volatile. Schiff's insistence on restraint appealed to voters who fear escalation above all else. They see every breach of decorum as a step toward chaos. Their instinct is to reinforce norms even when those norms feel strained. That instinct has kept institutions intact through worse moments. But it also risks preserving habits that no longer match reality. Vance's instinct appealed to voters who feel those norms have already failed them. They see restraint as a one-way expectation. From their view, refusing to respond doesn't protect civility. It rewards incivility. They're less worried about escalation than about erosion. And erosion, once normalized, is hard to reverse. The clash exposed how divided Americans are on what leadership should look like now. Is it better to model restraint even when it feels unfair? Or is it better to model boundaries even when they disrupt tradition? There's no consensus, and pretending there is only deepens the divide. That uncertainty is now part of the political landscape. One subtle but important consequence was how the incident reframed vulnerability. Traditionally, vulnerability in politics is curated and strategic. This wasn't that. It was messy, unscripted, and therefore unsettling. Unsettling moments force recalibration, whether institutions like it or not. Some analysts suggested the episode would fade, another flash in the outrage economy. But that underestimated its symbolic weight. It touched on identity, family, and belonging, themes that don't disappear easily. Once those themes surface, they tend to resurface again. They demand reckoning, not just commentary. Schiff's response, careful and controlled, represented continuity. Vance's response, blunt and emotional, represented disruption. Neither fully addressed the underlying incentive problem. As long as attention rewards provocation, provocation will persist. Leaders are reacting to a system that encourages extremes. The question then becomes not who was right, but what comes next. Will politicians retreat further into scripted language to avoid risk? Or will more of them abandon restraint when provoked? Each path carries costs. Each reshapes expectations. If restraint continues without consequence for those who cross lines, frustration will grow. If reactions escalate without limits, chaos becomes more likely. The balance between those outcomes is fragile. It requires mutual recognition that boundaries exist for everyone. That recognition feels scarce right now. What made this confrontation unavoidable was its simplicity. It wasn't about policy nuance or legislative maneuvering. It was about a basic social expectation. Leave families alone. When that expectation is violated, abstract arguments lose force. People respond viscerally. In that sense, Vance's reaction didn't create the controversy. It revealed it. The discomfort in Washington came from realizing that the old assumptions no longer hold, that leaders can't rely on silence to diffuse everything. And that appeals to decorum alone. Don't answer personal harm. Schiff's warning about precedent still matters. There are real dangers in normalizing unfiltered anger from high office. History offers plenty of cautionary tales, but history also shows moments when restraint without reciprocity collapses. Ignoring that tension doesn't make it go away. The unresolved nature of the clash is precisely why it stuck. It didn't deliver closure. It delivered a mirror. Viewers saw their own expectations reflected back at them, and those expectations don't align neatly anymore. As the noise settled, one thing became clear. American politics is renegotiating its boundaries in public. That process is messy, uncomfortable, and often ugly. Moments like this aren't anomalies. They're signals. Signals that the old equilibrium is gone. Whether the new equilibrium will be healthier remains an open question. What's certain is that pretending nothing has changed is no longer viable. Leaders will keep facing moments where restraint and reaction collide. How they navigate those moments will shape public trust. And trust, once fractured, is far harder to rebuild than to lose. In the end, the confrontation wasn't about winning an argument. It was about exposing a fault line that had been widening quietly for years. Schiff named the risk of escalation. Vance named the cost of silence. Between those two warnings lies the future of political conduct. That future will not be decided by one sentence or one reaction. It will be decided by whether Americans demand boundaries with accountability, whether they tolerate cruelty in the name of free expression, whether they expect leaders to be symbols or people. Those questions don't have easy answers, but they can't be ignored anymore. The shouting may fade, but the recalibration won't. Washington can debate it endlessly, but the public has already felt it. Once felt, it can't be unfelt. The line that was crossed remains crossed, and the line that was drawn remains drawn. What followed next was not resolution, but exposure, the kind that makes everyone slightly uneasy because it refuses to land cleanly on one side. The conversation stopped being about whether a line had been crossed and became about who was expected to pretend they never saw it. Washington prefers disputes that can be settled with statements and counterstatements, not ones that force a rethink of behavior. This one did the latter, and that's why it lingered. It didn't fit into a press release. Behind closed doors, aides and operatives began admitting something they would never say on camera. They acknowledged that the old strategy of ignoring personal attacks had stopped working a long time ago. It worked when outrage was slower, when attacks were contained, when families could stay out of the blast radius. It doesn't work in an environment where everything is permanent, searchable, and monetized. Silence doesn't de-escalate anymore. It just leaves space. That reality complicated Schiff's position more than his public comments suggested. Even some who agreed with him privately admitted that restraint now comes with asymmetric costs. The burden falls heavier on those whose families are easier targets. When attacks are personalized, restraint becomes a moral demand placed on the victim, not the aggressor. That imbalance gnaws at public patience. At the same time, there was no appetite for full-scale normalization of outrage from the top. People understood instinctively that a politics driven entirely by impulse would be corrosive. They didn't want leaders screaming into microphones every time something crossed a line. What they wanted, though they struggled to articulate it, was proportion. And proportion is hard to define without shared norms. That's where the debate kept stalling. Everyone agreed the environment is broken. No one agreed on how to function inside it without making things worse. Schiff warned about institutional decay. Vance warned about personal limits. The humor that continued to circulate reflected that stalemate. People joked that Washington wants leaders to be human only during campaign ads. Others joked that restraint is just another word for taking it quietly. The laughter wasn't cruel, it was weary. It carried the tone of people who feel trapped between bad options. One recurring question refused to go away. If families are off limits, who enforces that norm? If leaders won't respond and platforms won't intervene consistently, what remains? Appeals to decency sound hollow when decency isn't reciprocated. That vacuum is what Vance's reaction filled, intentionally or not. Schiff's critics seized on that point relentlessly. They argued that his framework assumed a baseline of mutual respect that no longer exists. From their perspective, calling for restraint without addressing enforcement was incomplete. It felt like asking people to keep playing by rules no one else follows. That sentiment resonated far beyond partisan lines. Yet Schiff's supporters countered with an equally persistent concern. They feared that validating emotional retaliation would open the door to worse behavior later. Once leaders justify reacting personally, the threshold keeps dropping. What begins as boundary setting can slide into perpetual grievance. History offers enough examples to make that fear reasonable. The standoff between those views mirrored a deeper cultural divide. Some Americans still see politics as an arena that demands emotional containment. Others see it as inseparable from lived experience. Those perspectives aren't easily reconciled. They coexist uncomfortably, colliding whenever something personal breaks through. What made this moment different was how visibly that collision played out. There was no policy complexity to hide behind, no technical language to blur responsibility. It was raw, understandable, and therefore harder to deflect. Everyone watching could imagine themselves in the situation. That relatability is what made the episode so hard to dismiss as mere theater. People didn't need experts to explain why it mattered. They felt it intuitively. They recognized the impulse to defend family. They also recognized the danger of letting anger dictate conduct. As weeks passed, the immediate outrage cooled, but the questions stayed. Campaigns quietly adjusted their internal conversations about response strategies. Media figures recalibrated how they discussed personal targeting. Even critics of Vance softened their language, acknowledging that something had shifted. The ground rules, if they ever existed, were being renegotiated in public. Schiff continued to emphasize caution, but with a slightly different tone. Less admonishment, more warning. He spoke about consequences rather than propriety. That shift suggested recognition that the old moral framing wasn't landing. The argument had to adapt, or it would be ignored. Vance, for his part, didn't keep escalating. He didn't turn the moment into a recurring tactic. That restraint mattered to observers who feared a slippery slope. It suggested the reaction was situational, not performative. That distinction blunted some criticism, though not all. Still, the underlying issue remained unresolved. The system incentivizes provocation while discouraging response. That mismatch guarantees more flashpoints. Every public figure now knows their family can become fair game. Every response carries risk. The confrontation exposed how little infrastructure exists to handle that reality. Institutions are built to manage policy conflict, not personal harm. They rely on norms that assume a level of shared restraint. When that restraint evaporates, the machinery creaks. Moments like this are the sound of that creaking. Observers began to frame the episode less as a scandal and more as a stress fracture, a sign that the weight placed on political conduct has exceeded the structure's capacity. You can reinforce the beams, or you can pretend the crack isn't there. Pretending has been the default for years. This time, it didn't hold. What unnerved Washington most wasn't Vance's language. It was the public's reaction to it. Large numbers of people didn't recoil. They nodded. Not because they loved the words, but because they recognized the boundary being asserted. That recognition unsettled those invested in the old expectations. Schiff's emphasis on restraint still appealed to many, particularly those wary of further polarization, but it now shared space with a competing demand: enforceable limits. Without enforcement, norms feel symbolic. Symbols don't stop behavior. That realization altered the calculus. The conversation drifted toward uncomfortable territory. If norms rely on good faith, what happens when good faith disappears? Can institutions manufacture respect? Can silence shame aggressors? Or does it simply clear the path? No one offered a definitive answer, and that ambiguity was the point. The clash didn't settle the issue, it surfaced it. It forced acknowledgement that American politics is operating without a shared understanding of boundaries. Until that understanding is rebuilt, moments like this will recur. Each one will test the system anew. In hindsight, the episode may be remembered less for what was said than for what it revealed. That restraint is no longer universally trusted. That emotional authenticity has political currency. That institutions are struggling to adapt to a personalized, permanent information environment, and that families have become unavoidable participants. The uneasy takeaway is that neither Schiff nor Vance offered a complete solution. Schiff named the risk of breakdown without fully addressing provocation. Vance named the cost of silence without fully addressing escalation. The truth likely sits uncomfortably between them. And discomfort is not something Washington handles gracefully. What's clear is that the old assumption that personal attacks could be ignored into irrelevance is gone. Ignoring now looks like indifference. Responding looks like instability. Leaders are trapped in that double bind. How they navigate it will shape public trust more than any single policy debate. For viewers, the moment served as a kind of calibration. It forced them to ask what they actually expect from leadership. Do they want symbolic restraint or lived boundaries? Do they want calm at any cost or fairness even when it's messy? Those preferences will influence how future moments are judged. The confrontation didn't end an era, but it signaled the strain on one. An era where silence was assumed to be virtuous. An era where families were supposedly off-limits by default. An era where institutions could absorb abuse without responding. That era is wobbling. What replaces it is still unclear. It may be a renegotiated norm, enforced unevenly but acknowledged openly. It may be a more volatile environment where reactions are judged case by case. Or it may be something less stable, defined by constant recalibration. None of those options are particularly comforting. What can't be denied is that the shouting wasn't the story. The story was the pause afterward, the collective realization that something fundamental had shifted. That realization didn't come with applause or outrage alone. It came with unease. And unease, more than anger, tends to drive lasting change. Whether that change leads to clearer boundaries or deeper chaos depends on choices yet to be made. By leaders, by institutions, and by the public itself. Moments like this don't dictate outcomes. They expose fault lines. What happens next determines whether those lines become breaks or bridges. In the end, nothing about this confrontation resolved cleanly, and that may be the most honest part of it. There was no apology that satisfied everyone, no statement that put the genie back in the bottle, no neat moral lesson Washington could package and move past. Instead, there was a lingering discomfort, the kind that tells you a boundary was tested and the old map no longer matches the terrain. Politics didn't break in that moment, but it exposed how fragile its customs have become, and fragility, once seen, can't be unseen. For J.D. Vance, the message was clear and intentionally narrow. He wasn't asking for admiration, permission, or consensus. He was drawing a line and signaling that, at least for him, silence was no longer the default response. Some will call that reckless, others will call it overdue, but few can pretend it was accidental. It was a choice, made with eyes open, in a system that rarely rewards restraint anyway. For Adam Schiff, the warning ran in the opposite direction. Once leaders abandon measured language, he argued, the floor drops out fast. What feels justified today becomes normalized tomorrow, and eventually weaponized by everyone. His concern wasn't about one man or one family, but about precedent. And precedent in politics has a way of outliving intentions. The public, watching all of this, wasn't really choosing sides so much as taking notes. They noticed who sounded abstract and who sounded human. They noticed how quickly outrage spreads and how slowly norms are rebuilt. They noticed that the people asking for calm rarely bear the cost of silence. And they noticed that families, once dragged into the arena, never truly leave it. What this moment ultimately revealed is that American politics is no longer operating on shared assumptions. There is no consensus on where debate ends and personal harm begins. There is no agreed-upon referee, no trusted mechanism to enforce restraint. Everything is negotiated in real time, in public, under pressure. That makes every reaction heavier than it looks. This wasn't a triumph or a collapse, just a signal that the rules many leaders still cite no longer protect the people they're meant to. A signal that appeals to dignity mean less when dignity feels one-sided. A signal that politics has fully collided with identity, family, and private life. And collisions, by definition, leave marks. What comes next depends less on what was said than on what is learned. Whether leaders recalibrate or double down. Whether institutions adapt or cling to habits that no longer work. Whether voters reward composure, authenticity, or something in between. Those answers won't arrive in one news cycle. For now, all that's certain is this. The whispering is over. The shouting didn't start something new. It exposed what was already there. And from this point forward, every political figure knows the same uncomfortable truth. The personal is no longer optional, and pretending otherwise won't make it go away. What makes this ending unsettling is not the volume of the moment, but the quiet recognition that followed it. After the clips stopped looping and the panels moved on to the next outrage, something stayed lodged in the background of the conversation. It was the sense that everyone had just witnessed a rule being tested and found thinner than expected. Not broken beyond repair, but no longer sturdy enough to lean on without consequence. And Washington, more than any other place, hates discovering that its assumptions are outdated. For years, political culture relied on a simple bargain that almost everyone pretended to accept. Public figures would absorb personal abuse, families would remain officially off-limits, and the system would reward those who endured quietly. That bargain was never written down, never enforced, and never evenly applied. But it existed as a shared fiction. As long as most people acted as if it were real, it functioned. The problem is that fictions collapse the moment enough people stop believing in them. This episode forced that collapse into the open. It revealed how often restraint has been demanded from the same people in the same situations, while others faced no comparable expectation. It showed how easily calls for civility become selective, deployed only after damage is done. It also showed how little comfort abstract principles provide when the harm feels immediate and personal. Those tensions didn't start here, but they became impossible to ignore. The reaction from the public mattered more than the reaction from political elites. Viewers weren't focused on etiquette or decorum in the abstract. They were measuring authenticity, fairness, and proportionality in a way that felt deeply intuitive. Many didn't cheer the language, but they understood the boundary being drawn. Understanding, in this context, proved more powerful than approval. That distinction explains why the moment refused to fade quietly. It wasn't embraced as a model, nor rejected as a scandal. It hovered in an uncomfortable middle ground, forcing people to sit with unresolved questions. Should leaders be expected to endure anything without response? If not, who decides where response becomes excess? Adam Schiff's warnings about erosion of standards resonated for a reason. History offers no shortage of examples where normalization of emotional retaliation led to worse outcomes. Once leaders justify reactions based on personal offense, politics risks becoming a competition of grievances. That path ends badly more often than not. His caution wasn't theatrical. It was grounded in institutional memory. At the same time, his framework struggled to address a more immediate concern. What happens when restraint becomes indistinguishable from permission? What happens when silence is interpreted as weakness, or worse, as acceptance? What happens when families are targeted precisely because they are assumed to be untouchable? Those questions don't disappear just because they're uncomfortable. J.D. Vance's response tapped into that unease. Not because it offered a universal solution, but because it acknowledged a limit. He didn't argue that outrage should replace discipline. He argued that discipline without boundaries is unsustainable. That argument landed with people who feel boundaries have been ignored for too long. The humor that followed captured the contradiction perfectly. Late-night jokes about politicians being human only after 5 p.m. weren't really jokes at all. They were critiques disguised as laughter. They pointed out the absurdity of demanding emotional restraint while incentivizing personal attacks. Satire, as always, did what formal debate couldn't. What this moment ultimately exposed is a misalignment between expectations and incentives. The system punishes restraint and rewards provocation. It demands dignity while monetizing outrage. It asks families to endure exposure without offering protection. No amount of moral lecturing fixes that structural problem. Washington's discomfort stems from recognizing this misalignment without knowing how to correct it. Institutions move slowly by design, but the environment around them moves at the speed of reaction. Norms built for a slower era are being stress-tested daily. Each test leaves them weaker, not stronger. Eventually, adaptation becomes unavoidable. One possible outcome is a recalibration of what is considered fair response. Not a free-for-all, but a clearer acknowledgement that personal targeting carries consequences. Another is continued drift, where reactions are judged inconsistently and controversy becomes routine. Neither option is particularly attractive, but pretending the issue doesn't exist is no longer viable. The public's role in this recalibration cannot be overstated. Viewers are no longer passive consumers of political behavior. They reward what feels genuine and punish what feels scripted. They notice when calls for restraint sound disconnected from lived experience. Trust, once lost, is difficult to recover. This is why the episode felt less like a scandal and more like a marker. A line in the timeline where expectations subtly shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but perceptibly. From this point forward, silence will be interpreted differently. So will reaction. Future leaders will study this moment carefully. Some will misread it as license to escalate. Others will misread it as proof that restraint is obsolete. Both interpretations miss the point. The lesson isn't about volume, it's about legitimacy. Legitimacy, in modern politics, is earned through coherence. When words, actions, and expectations align, audiences are forgiving. When they don't, no amount of explanation repairs the gap. Vance's reaction felt coherent to many because it matched a widely shared intuition. Schiff's caution felt coherent to others because it aligned with institutional preservation. The tension between those intuitions defines the current moment. It's a tension between immediacy and longevity, between emotional reality and structural stability, between defending boundaries and preventing escalation. There is no easy synthesis. What makes this particularly difficult is that both sides are reacting to genuine failures. The failure to protect families, the failure to enforce norms consistently, the failure to adapt institutions to a transformed information landscape. Each failure compounds the others. Blame becomes diffuse, responsibility harder to assign. As a result, politics feels increasingly personal, even when the issues are systemic. Individuals become symbols for broader breakdowns. Their reactions are scrutinized not just for content, but for what they imply about the system. Every response becomes a proxy debate about what politics should be. That's an impossible burden to place on any one moment. And yet, moments like this matter precisely because they force that debate into the open. They disrupt complacency. They challenge assumptions that no longer hold. They reveal fault lines that polite conversation avoids. Discomfort, in that sense, becomes productive. The danger lies in mistaking exposure for resolution. Identifying a problem does not solve it. Acknowledging broken norms does not rebuild them. That work requires intention, consistency, and patience. Qualities in short supply during election cycles. Still, ignoring the issue guarantees further erosion. Every instance of personal targeting that goes unanswered lowers the bar. Every response that crosses into excess does the same. The space between those outcomes is narrowing. Navigating it will define the next phase of American politics. What remains to be seen is whether leaders can articulate new expectations that feel credible. Expectations that recognize human limits without endorsing chaos. That protect families without shielding bad faith actors. That discourage abuse without demanding silence. That balance won't emerge accidentally. For now, the moment stands as a warning rather than a blueprint. A warning that the old rules no longer govern behavior. A warning that appeals to dignity require reciprocal respect. A warning that ignoring personal harm doesn't make it disappear. And a warning that unchecked outrage in any direction carries costs. The lasting impact may not be measured in polls or headlines. It may show up in how future controversies are handled, in how quickly lines are drawn and where, in how audiences react to calls for calm versus assertions of boundary, in how families are discussed or avoided altogether. Ultimately, this episode asked a question that has no final answer yet. What does responsible leadership look like in an environment that rewards irresponsibility? Is restraint still virtuous when it enables harm? Is reaction justified when institutions fail to protect? Those questions will resurface again and again. What's clear is that pretending the question doesn't exist is no longer an option. The whispering era is over, not because people chose shouting, but because silence stopped working. The challenge now is finding a language that acknowledges reality without surrendering to it, that defends humanity without dissolving standards, that restores trust without denying pain. Whether American politics is capable of that balance remains uncertain. But moments like this ensure the issue can't be ignored. They force a reckoning, however uncomfortable. And they remind everyone watching that behind every abstract debate are real people, real families, and real consequences. That recognition, more than any soundbite, may be the most consequential outcome of all.